Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at a really provocative set of sources. They combine, well, theology, history, and economics to launch this deep fundamental critique against government welfare and, any kind of coerced redistribution. And just to be clear, we're not really debating policy outcomes here today. It's more about analyzing the argument these sources make, the structure of it. And the core tension they raise is, well, it's pretty sharp. It's like when a majority votes to tax and redistribute wealth, is that just, necessary social utility, a safety net, or as these sources claim, does it cross some kind of fundamental, absolute moral line?
Yeah, and the framing is, I think, really key to how powerful their critique feels.
Hmm.
They start by diagnosing what they call a fatal structural flaw in systems based on majority rule. And they bring in that Tytler quote, the one, it might be apocryphal, but the idea is potent.
Yeah.
That a republic basically eats itself when voters figure out they can, quote, vote themselves largesse from the public treasury.
Right, that famous quote.
Right, and that idea, that mechanism is what they really focus on. So our mission today, what we're unpacking, is their argument that once voters discover this power, the whole system, where the majority basically uses the law to take from a minority, well, it stops being governance. It becomes what they call legalized theft. And that, for them, fundamentally violates the principle of free agency.
Okay, so let's dig into that structure they talk about. To establish this flaw as structural, they lean heavily on economics, public choice theory.
That's right. James Buchanan and Gordon Tillich, the calculus of consent. That's the foundation.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is how they use it to explain this systemic incentive misalignment. They argue government spending follows a pretty simple formula. Benefits are concentrated, but the costs are diffuse.
Okay, explain that a bit more. Concentrated versus diffuse.
So imagine you're part of a specific interest group, maybe a big corporation or a local farming community. You push for and maybe get a direct concentrated benefit, a subsidy, a grant, maybe a tariff protecting your industry. It's substantial for you. But who pays? Millions of taxpayers. And because that cost is spread so thinly, so diffusely across everyone, the cost to any single taxpayer is tiny, almost unnoticeable.
Right, so there's no real reason for an individual taxpayer to spend time and energy fighting it.
Exactly. You have almost no incentive to fight it. But the group getting the benefit, they have every incentive to lobby like crazy for it.
And this isn't just theory, right? The sources point to actual data.
You do. They cite a 2021 study in the journal Public Choice. It found that incumbent re-election rates go up directly with how much federal money flows into their district per person.
Even controlling for things like party or ideology.
Yeah, even after controlling for those factors.
Wow. So the conclusion the sources draw from that is pretty stark.
It is. They say the system itself creates these perverse incentives. It explicitly rewards, in their words, plunder and punishes restraint.
Okay, I have to jump in here, though. What about the counter-argument? That some spending is necessary. Roads, defense, public health infrastructure. How do the sources handle that distinction?
They do address it, but they tend to frame it as maybe a bit of a distraction semantically. Their claim is once that Tytler mechanism kicks in the ability to vote yourself benefits paid for by others, the line between necessary public goods and just pure redistribution gets blurry. It becomes functionally irrelevant because the political incentive always pushes towards expanding the discretionary stuff, the goodies. And they argue history just shows this pattern repeating. Look at ancient Athens, for instance. The sources point out that popular votes funded things like jury pay, stipends for attending the assembly, and the really crucial grain doles.
Things that kept the voters happy, presumably.
Absolutely. But they argue this constant drain on the public treasury was a major structural weakness. And it contributed, they claim, to Athens' eventual defeat in the Peloponnesian War.
In Rome, the famous bread and circuses.
An equally predictable path, according to these sources. Subsidized grain, big public games. Wildly popular, yes. But that cycle of spending led to massive debt, serious inflation, and it created the political chaos that helped figures like Caesar rise to power.
Okay, so connecting that pattern to more recent history.
The sources see the same dynamic. They point to Greece's debt crisis in 2010. They link it directly to, like, a decade where public sector wages and pensions had jumped over 50%.
Wow.
Or look at Argentina. 9 national defaults since 1816. The sources are pretty blunt here. They say these aren't just random economic bad luck. They're the predictable result when that Tytler mechanism takes hold. Voters discover they can legally vote themselves wealth and, well, Fiscal sanity has an expiration date.
Okay, so the fiscal side is presented as a symptom. Now, the sources make a big shift, right, to the morality of it.
Exactly. The economic fallout is secondary in their view. The real problem, the root issue, is moral. They argue it violates an absolute moral law, starting right with the Eighth Commandment. Thou shalt not steal.
Thou shalt not steal, plain and simple.
And they mean absolute. The sources argue there's zero exceptions here. It doesn't matter if 51% of people vote for it. It doesn't matter if the intentions seem good, like helping the poor. Forcing someone, under threat of penalty from the state, to give up their property, that's theft. Full stop. Legislative approval doesn't change the moral nature of the act.
That brings us to Bastiat, doesn't it? Frederick Bastiat and legal plunder.
Precisely. His classic definition from, 1850? Plunder that's organized by law for the profit of those who make the law. The law, in this view, isn't stopping the theft. It's just giving it official sanction, turning a moral wrong into a legally okay transaction.
Because surely the justification people usually give is the social contract, right? You live here, you implicitly agree to the rules, including taxes.
The social contract. The sources really attack that justification. They see it as a kind of coercive fiction.
How so? What are their main criticisms?
They outline three big ones. First, you never signed it. No individual actually consents. It's just assumed. Second, there's no real way to opt out unless you leave the country, which is, a pretty extreme penalty, not a real choice for most.
Right.
And third, and this is crucial for them, this supposed contract binds future generations, people who weren't even born yet, who had absolutely no say.
So consent is the core issue.
Absolutely. They lean heavily on Lysander Spooner here, his work No Treason from 1870. Spooner basically argued that government authority, including taxation, always rests on the threat of punishment if you don't comply. And if you only do something because you're threatened, the sources argue that action lacks any real moral legitimacy. It's not true consent.
Okay, this is a crucial bridge. From economics and law to the deepest theological arguments in these sources, they connect coerced redistribution directly to, the fundamental nature of choice itself, going way back.
Right. Way back. This is where they bring in the theological narrative of the premortal council. We need to understand the context they're using here. In this narrative, the central conflict, the war in heaven, was fought over how humanity would be saved or redeemed. Satan's plan, according to their texts, was essentially to redeem all mankind by force, take away choice to ensure obedience.
Okay.
Christ's plan, in contrast, was centered entirely on agency, on voluntary choice, voluntary obedience.
So compulsion versus agency, that's the core conflict.
That's the core conflict they identify. Compulsion is the defining trait of the opposition's plan. They cite figures like Ezra Taft Benson, who argued the devil's substitute for the Lord's plan is compulsion. He would force us to do good.
Wow, that's applying a very high-stakes theological concept directly to government spending. How did they justify that leap?
The connection they make is stark. They label government welfare because it's funded by coerced taxation as compulsory salvation applied to economics. They might concede, perhaps, that state action could alleviate some poverty, but the moral choice to give freely is destroyed in the process. Forcing a good outcome in this theological framework actually spiritually harms the giver because it removes their agency in the act.
Which brings us to this concept of real intent. This seems absolutely central to their moral case. We should define that clearly.
Absolutely critical. Real intent, as the sources define it, is the genuine, unforced, heartfelt motive behind an action, especially giving. Without it, the act is spiritually empty. They point to scriptures like Moroni 7, which says, if a gift be not with real intent, it profiteth him nothing. It's spiritually void for the giver.
And there's that verse in Corinthians too, right, about not giving grudgingly.
Exactly. 2 Corinthians 9. Give as you purpose in your heart, not grudgingly, or of necessity. The key phrase there is of necessity. If you're only giving because you have to, because the state penalizes you if you don't pay taxes.
Then it lacks that real intent.
Precisely. The spiritual transaction is nullified. The giver acts out of necessity, not intent. And interestingly, the sources argue the recipient is also subtly harmed. They don't receive a blessing that comes from someone's genuine sacrifice. Instead, they receive an entitlement, which the sources worry fosters dependence, not gratitude or upliftment.
Okay, to really hammer this contrast home, the sources compare the modern welfare state to the Law of Consecration, or the United Order. They see these as fundamentally opposed systems.
Theological opposites, yes. Inverses in every way that matters to their argument. The law of consecration, even acknowledging its historical difficulties, was defined by certain principles. It was voluntary, people chose to join.
Okay.
It was local, typically administered by local bishops who knew the people involved. It was stewardship-based, people still controlled their property or capital. And crucially, it was meant to be temporary in a sense. People could withdraw if needed.
And the welfare state, by
Yeah.
comparison?
The exact opposite on all counts, according to the sources. It's mandatory, enforced by state penalties. It's centralized, run by distant bureaucracies. It's based on permanent taxation, not temporary consecration. And there's no opt-out short of leaving the country.
They quote Marion G. Romney on this point.
Yes. The United Order is voluntary. The welfare state is compulsory. One is the Lord's way, the other is Satan's counterfeit. That's the stark contrast they draw.
It's pretty striking how these sources weave everything, from ancient Athens to economics to deep theology, into this single narrative about compulsion versus agency.
And that focus on compulsion leads to another interesting part of their critique. What they see is the moral state of the majority who vote for these systems. They accuse the majority of essentially outsourcing their moral duty. Voting for the state to handle charity lets them avoid personal sacrifice and involvement.
While still feeling morally good about the policy itself.
Exactly. Claiming moral superiority for supporting the policy while not actually practicing the personal charity involved. And the sources don't just call this a policy difference. They label it with some pretty strong moral terms. It's coveting the 10th Commandment because it involves wanting what belongs to others and using the law to get it.
Uh-huh.
It's pride, they argue, because the voter implicitly assumes they know better how to use someone else's money than the person who earned it.
Okay.
And finally, it's hypocrisy, demanding a form of charity from others through force that they aren't necessarily willing to practice voluntarily themselves.
This echoes that warning from J. Reuben Clark the sources mention about threats coming even from within, seeking to destroy the agency of man.
Right. And the sources really emphasize good intentions aren't enough. The goal, like alleviating poverty, might seem noble. But if the method involves violating agency and property rights, violating moral law, then the intention doesn't make the action righteous. Intentions don't sanctify sin, as they put it.
So what's the alternative they propose? What does the Lord's economy, as they call it, look like?
It's entirely based on those voluntary principles we've discussed. Tithing, for example, paid freely with that crucial real intent. Fast offerings, given anonymously, ideally from a position of humility, a broken heart.
Mm-hmm.
And service, they point to Mosiah, service to your fellow beings is service to God, but only if it's your service, meaning freely chosen, uncompelled action, not something mandated.
This brings up a really profound theological point they make. Why is this uncompelled choice so absolutely vital in their framework? They connect it to the veil of forgetfulness.
Yes, and we need to quickly unpack that concept to see why it's so important here. The sources explain the veil. The idea that we don't remember our premortal existence serves a critical purpose. If we did remember that counsel, if we remembered choosing agency over compulsion back then.
Choice here in mortality wouldn't be a real test, would it? It'd be obvious.
Exactly. The memory would essentially compel the choice. The veil removes that prior context. It forces us to make an authentic, uncompelled moral choice now, based on our character here. So the test of this life in this framework is precisely to reveal true character under conditions of forgetting. The sources argue that the true soldiers of God are those who, even without that memory, without earthly applause, without being forced, still choose agency, still choose voluntary giving, still resist what they see as legal plunder. They prove their true allegiance through their unforced choices now.
That's a powerful idea. The entire purpose is the unforced choice for what's right.
Yes. And pulling it all together, the sources outline what they call the remnant's duty in practical terms. It's usually have 4 main parts. First, personally practice virtuous giving. Pay tithing and fast offerings with real intent.
Okay, lead by example.
Second, teach principles of self-reliance and personal charity to others. Counter the dependency narrative. Third, actively resist the counterfeit system of compulsion, politically or socially, even if you're in the minority.
Stand for principle.
And finally, focus on building Zion, their ideal community, through voluntary means, through actual consecration, not state force.
Which brings us right back to where we started this deep dive and that core tension. If charity, true charity, is defined theologically as the pure love of Christ, which has to be freely given, here's the final question the sources seem to pose to you, the listener. If love and compulsion are opposites, can true love ever be legislated? Can genuine charity ever really be compelled by law or penalty? The sources seem to answer with a firm no, arguing agency is paramount. So maybe something to think about is this. What actions, political or economic, are you taking purely out of choice, not necessity? What demonstrates your own commitment to voluntary action over compulsion?